Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 149 of Humanity Rising. Ubiquity University launched Humanity Rising with over 350 partnering organizations in the middle of the pandemic so that we could provide essentially a public service, an open space, so that people globally could come together to share their experiences of what it's like navigating through this extraordinary, challenging pandemic, and take counsel one with another as to what we can offer into the world, what visions, what solutions, what strategies that will enable the world community to endure and to come out the other side more resilient and healthy and abundant, resilient and in alignment with natural systems. One of the advantages of broadcasting every day, Monday through Friday since August, is that we've been able to cover all kinds of issues relating to the broad spectrum of human concerns. Last week, we delved into the issue of grief, and that elicited a rather large number of deeply moving communications that I received. People were deeply moved by the sessions on grief and the permission, the encouragement that we were making for people to honor their grief. We're in a world that is going so fast. We're in a world that has reduced almost everything to a soundbite. We're in a world of turbulence and volatility where we're almost afraid to think about the future. And we're terrified at really encountering our past, because our past is full of trauma, transgenerational trauma that is inhabiting every moment of our lives. And the future, my God, the future is so uncertain, so problematic. It's hard to know what even to hope for. As this pandemic, which started in January and gained momentum in February and then just spilled forth in March, in November, is even stronger. And in country after country, as we've seen day by day, particularly in the United States, where just in this past week, 16 states posted record COVID cases, as 4% of the human population has between 20 and 25% of all the COVID cases and the COVID deaths. People are dying every 60 seconds. Hospitals are overflowing. And then we moved from grief, and we spent essentially the rest of the week grappling with the fact that our grief is contained in a unity of everything. And we looked at the physics of David Baum and the spiritual insights of Krishnamurti. With Joe Truss, we looked at the sacred geometry that comprises, that constitutes the unity of space, out of which matter emerges. We looked at how we are nature, and that simply by understanding that we are nature, we gain wisdom, we gain insight. And then we concluded the week with a remarkable, and I would say sublime, discourse by Zvi Ish Shalom on the Kabbalah, one of the deepest mystical traditions known to humankind. that finds its source in prehistory and was brought to a beautiful, refined embodiment in the 13th century Spain through the Zohar. Another perspective on how the unity of everything is constructed, and through the polarities, and through the primacy of the feminine, creation unfolds into an ever more complex work of beauty. And today, we come to the question of education. How do you take all this, the unity of the world, our unity with nature, the fact that we are now scientifically proving that we are interconnected with the whole? How do you teach the young? What are the principles that are available to educate the fundamental truth about existence? And that is harmony. And that's our program for today. And so I want to welcome all of you. I thank you all for all your support and your participation. It's been a privilege day by day and week by week and now month by month as this pandemic continues to scourge our societies, to be an oasis, an island of coherence in this raging sea of chaos. And thank you so much for joining this community of Humanity Rising. So on that note, I would like to welcome my good friend and colleague, Sabina van Gafka from Sweden, who will commence our program. Sabina, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And just like you, I echo that. I want to say welcome to all of our viewers around the world, all of our collaborators around the world, the bridge builders, the catalysts, because just as Jim said, this really is a unified and collaborative effort to both raise topics on all aspects of life and how we really transition from this era of COVID, but also era of the new normal and transition into the next normal in a sense. And all of these conversations we also really hope will ignite and spark actions and collaborations, which it is already organically doing. And that is also why this is so purpose-driven by both me, Jim, everyone behind Ubiquity University, our chat people, the individuals in our chat who are contributing also with a lot of ideas and collaborations, and of course, all of our viewers around the world. And education is really, really such a fundamental topic, because that's really the start of how we are navigated into the world and into the way of being. And that is why it's an important topic to have, and we're going to have it from different perspectives. Today it's looking at how can nature's principles of harmony guide and inform a new way of learning to live, and also a new way of education. And it's our guest speaker today, who is Richard Dunn, who leads the Harmony Project, which in itself is an educational system that is sprung from his clear vision for the future of education. And that is based on a curriculum informed by the principles of harmony and based on what Richard calls enquiries of learning. And that inquiry of learning of life, and not that sort of competitive mode of just absorbing a lot of information, but actually having an inquiry of how we learn and how we also navigate our way and our path through life. And many say that in education, the idea of connectedness means that rather than having separate different subjects, like our curriculum in today's schools is based upon, you either have maths or you have science, art, geography, or whatever it might be, instead adopting an integrated and holistic spectrum of subjects, maybe around a topic, for example, climate change. And then basing that on an inquiry of learning with all the key disciplines exploring the reference of the topic. And Richard Dunn himself is a thought leader in education and sustainability, and he has a 30-year career in education behind him, where he's developed a school curriculum that is based, like I mentioned, on the principles of harmony, that enables systems in nature who are also resilient, healthy, and in balance. And taking these principles as a way to guide and inform the way of a harmony curriculum structure that is then aiming to provide a coherent and meaningful framework for a national or global curriculum learning objective based on all of these principles that Richard will talk about. And just to sort of navigate you into the Harmony project, Richard describes it as it's having a project-based approach in which it's possible to fulfill curriculum requirements in an interconnected way that is both engaging and also stimulating initially for children. And he also sees the significance of a harmonious education system that is based on a flexible curriculum informed by 7 key harmony principles, including nature's cyclic structures such as seasons, weather patterns, water, food, carbon cycles, interdependence, geometry, and so forth. And really looking at why there is such an urgency to apply this kind of holistic approach, interweaving also soft skills into the educational system, to really ensure that young people, well, initially all people, but we start with the young people, to acquire the skills and knowledge that they need to engage with issues that really have to do with humanity or planetary issues, whether it's climate change, sustainability, or all those different palettes that are integrated into how we really can utilize our education to make the world a more sustainable and better place. So before we learn more about this with Richard, like we always do every time in Humanity Rising, let's gather and unite in a 1-minute heart coherence, just uniting our heartbeat, uniting our intention, opening our heart, opening our mind to different perspectives, and also allowing ourselves to be here and now. So just with a few inhales and exhales for 1 minute, let us just be in heart coherence. Taking that 1 minute, and also remembering that just using our breath to align ourselves in that sort of 1 minute short breath meditation also allows us to be less reactive and more responsive and contemplative towards the discussion that we're now going to have, and also towards different aspects in our own lives. So with that, I just want to hand over the word to our guest speaker of today, Richard Dunn.
Thank you very much, Sabina and Jim, for those very warm words of welcome. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this afternoon in the UK, and I'm delighted to be able to share this platform with you and to share the Harmony Project's work for you through this presentation. I was thinking just then in that moment of quiet about the importance of sound and music and singing in our lives. And one of the great sadnesses at the moment actually is that the COVID challenge and how that's impacting on schools is meaning that many schools are not doing any kind of singing at the moment. And I was thinking just then how we need to be creative around maybe taking children outside and singing outside. We can't let these challenges limit us in some of the really important aspects of what we do and how we work and live together every day. So Jim gave a wonderful welcome at the beginning there, and I want to pick up on one particular word, which is the word of hope. And probably right now, more than at many times, we need that sense of hope in what we are doing and where we're going. And for those of you that work in education, you will know, and if you have your own children, of course, you'll know that children, for all that they may be challenging sometimes, give us a lovely sense of hope. And so what I share today is very much with them in mind, their future in mind, their well-being in mind, and of course, their education in mind. And these principles of nature, these principles of harmony that have been referenced already, are, I believe, now more important than ever in guiding and providing a context for how we can learn into the future. And of course, they're relevant to children in schools and in education settings, but they're also really important for all of us in terms of how we see the world, this lens into the world. Just before I begin my presentation, I will come back to him later, but I wanted to reference His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, who has been such an inspiration to this work that I've developed. And he wrote a book called Harmony, A New Way of Looking at the World. And he shared that and wrote that nearly 10 or around 10 years ago now. And it had such an impact on my understanding of how education could be that I wrote to him to ask if there was a way in which we could develop those kind of practices in education. And really what I share today is a lot of the results and the hard work of that conversation and that opportunity. I thought it might be interesting for you just to give you a little bit of a background about me, because I'm coming to you as someone as a new face, and it might be helpful for you just to understand a little bit about my story. So I'm the oldest of 4 children, and I grew up in the southwest of London. And my education was very formal, very academic, as it probably was for many of you. And I learned and worked hard, but nothing ever really made sense to me. I did it because I had to do it, and I did it to pass exams and jump through the hoops to get through the system. And then after I finished my schooling and my degree, I went traveling, and I traveled around the world, and I finished in Calcutta. And I worked in one of Mother Teresa's homes in Calcutta. And it gave me a completely different perspective on life and my place in the world. So when I came back, I did 1 or 2 jobs back in the UK, but I was drawn into education. And over many years now, I've been exploring how we can get the right balance between acknowledging the need for high standards in reading, writing, maths, and so on, but doing it in a way that has relevance for our young people, that gives them a sense of purpose as to why they're doing what they're doing. So I'll run through the slideshow now, and it'll take probably about 40 minutes or so. And then we'll open up the questions and the conversation, and hopefully have a really interesting dialogue. So please keep asking questions as we go through, and then I will bring those into the conversation and we can discuss them further. So let me just share my screen now. And hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Richard. I lost you for about a minute.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yeah, why don't you start over from the beginning?
Great. Okay, let me go from here. So this is the first proper slide after the introduction. So a few years ago, I went to Antarctica and I went on an expedition to set up an education base there run on renewable energy. And it's the most extraordinary place to visit, full, as you can see from this image, full of awe and wonder. And more than anything, I was struck by the silence, this extraordinary silence in this beautiful place. And during my time there, I became aware through the conversations we were having that this place in Antarctica was changing because of the way we were behaving and our practices that were creating fossil fuel and climate change and impacting on this beautiful place. So, sorry, let me just come out here. My screen share has just got stuck there. So let me just come back in. Sorry. Okay, my apologies. The screen share didn't quite work there. So let me try it again and we'll start from here. There we go. So I got this really strong sense that our world is changing, and it made me realize that if a place like Antarctica can change so dramatically, then we need to be really thinking about how we're educating. So the current education system that we're in my sense, is not working because it's not relevant enough and purposeful enough and indeed empowering enough. And for young people, there is this sense a lot of, why am I learning this? What am I learning this for? So we need a different model. And now in the time of COVID and with so much questioning around what we're doing, how we're living, where we're going, it feels like the right time to be exploring a new way of learning, and one that addresses the issues of our time and gives our young people an opportunity to collaborate, to work together, and to do something about those challenges. We often talk about the need for children to learn in nature, and of course that's extremely important. But I think this work of harmony is more than that. It's about understanding the need to learn from nature and to see that its universal principles of life can teach us a different way of living in the world. Many of you may have read that WWF earlier this year shared this report on biodiversity, and they highlighted that 68% of our biodiversity has disappeared in just 50 years. This is a damning indictment of the way we're living, actually. And it was another reminder to me of the fact that we need to find a different model, one that works very much in balanced relationship with the natural world. The CEO of WWF International shared this quote that nature is unraveling and our planet is flashing red warning signs. A deep cultural and systemic shift is urgently needed. And yet when I speak with young people, as I did last week to some students in the US, they have this real concern that a lot of their learning is not relevant to these concerns, and it troubles them. Many of you will have experienced the forest fires of this year, and they've taken place all over the world. I love this quote from Greta Thunberg: "If I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." So we have this sense of urgency around what we need to do, but we also, as we did so beautifully at the beginning of this session, we need to take time to be still, to connect, to find peace in our troubles. Coming back to the idea of Antarctica, the ice is melting at an unprecedented rate, and that's going to have huge implications for the future. We need to learn how to adapt for the future. In fact, one of the governors of the school where I was head teacher talked about how he wished he'd learnt the subject, the future, and what it would mean in terms of being creative and imaginative about possibilities and ways forward. We know that our heavily industrialized monoculture farming systems are also creating many challenges around climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. And there are the implications for us too of eating unhealthy food, processed food, and the reality of how do you balance cost and price with a healthier way of farming. We've touched already today on this global pandemic and the way it has devastated so many people's lives. And my hope out of all these challenges is that it helps us to redefine how we live in relationship with nature and how we live in relationship indeed with one another. If I asked you what this word harmony means, I wonder what you would say. Here are a few suggestions. We would probably very early on in a conversation about harmony talk about this idea of balance. We'd also relate it to health and wholeness and the lovely connection between the word health and whole. And we know it's about relationships, healthy relationships, relationships that work in this balanced harmony. So it's systemic, it's cyclical, it's diverse and inclusive. It connects the one to the oneness, and its outcomes are beautiful. And for children, that's a magical thing to know that when we create beautiful outcomes, we're replicating these beautiful outcomes in the world around us. So we know that it's set around these universal laws or principles. And what I want to share now is how I believe it can inform a new way of learning to live. Earlier this year, I produced this book, A New Way of Looking at and Learning About Our World. It's a teacher's guide, but it's actually a guide for all of us to explore and question how these principles can inform our day-to-day lives. I mentioned earlier the Prince of Wales and his key influence on this work. And this is the foreword that he very kindly wrote for this teacher's guide. And if I draw your attention to the 4th paragraph, he says, unless we recognize how nature strives for health by seeking harmony and understand that we too are very much part of this integrated self-sustaining system, then we will continue to struggle in our response to the major crises we face. So there's a very clear message there that we need to look at things and understand things in terms of our relationship to nature, that we are not separate from it, we are nature. A particular quote that I love from the book is this reassuring message that all we have to see is that the solutions are close at hand. So let's explore now these principles. And I remember this quote from my first conversation with Jim Garrison, that if you don't start with the fundamental principles of life, you will go astray, and all the issues and challenges that we're facing can in many respects be traced back to a lack of understanding of how these principles work. So the first principle is this principle of interdependence, that nature teaches us that everything is connected. And if we understand that, then it has implications for how we live every day, the choices we make, the consequences of the things that we do. We become much more aware that life works systemically. Bees are a brilliant example of learning about systems thinking, as many of you who've experienced working with bees will understand. So we see from these children how captivated they are by bees working as a healthy, interdependent system. And we also know, of course, that bees are part of a pollination process, part of a wider healthy system. So bees and other insects playing this vital role. So bees as an example, but of course there are many, teach us the systemic nature of all life. And that honey that we spin off and enjoy in a local context is also good for us. That lovely sense that the well-being of the ecosystem around us can support our own well-being too. So bees pollinate flowers, flowers provide nectar for bees. This is a world of collaboration. And I think it's interesting how we've often talked about the survival of the fittest, and we know that there are elements of that, of course, in the natural world. But actually, we're beginning to realize that there's an awful lot of collaboration going on there too. Some of the books written about trees, woodlands, and forest teach us this too. This is a good friend of mine, Patrick Holden, who's the CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust and an organic farmer. And his understanding of the need to farm in harmony with nature is so integral to this deep understanding of harmony. And that when you work in this way and you see it on his farm, There's this incredible biodiversity. It's alive with goodness and health. So just to give you some examples, and these are examples from my own school context, where children from the youngest to the oldest, starting at the top here with the youngest, how my body works together, right through to looking at Antarctic ecosystems and seeing how climate change is impacting on them, and looking at the big picture of an interdependent world. All of these projects are projects that help young people to see the world in terms of connections. One of the things that's been really powerful about this work is that when we start to ask our children what they think these words mean, they interpret it in rich, fascinating ways. So you can see here some of the ways in which they understand interdependence, that it means that everything and everyone has a role. It's a values system where each element has a valued role to play. And they can see that when they look to the natural world, that ecosystems teach us interdependence. So if we just come back to this Antarctic example again, the inquiry of learning that these children would look at is Antarctica worth protecting? They can explore it as an ecosystem, marvel at its awe and wonder, and then we can explore the link between this place, Antarctica, and our place, and how our use of fossil fuel energy is changing and impacting on that very delicate and beautiful ecosystem. So the practical application of that is to say, okay, let's have a look at our energy in our school, and let's see if we can start to address that and change that and set targets. And children, you are going to lead this. You're going to be the change for this work. So when we get students, when we get children to become energy monitors in schools linked to a project like Antarctica, then they start to see the connections between the way they live and the impact that has on the wider world. So it was highlighted earlier in the introductions, but this inquiry-based approach to learning, where we take learning and we frame it around a big question, linking it to sustainability themes, absolutely feels now like the right way to be taking learning forward. The idea of subject-separate learning seems to, in my opinion, seems to have had its day. Of course, subject skills and knowledge are important, but when we frame them around meaningful, contextualized, cohesive projects, then it really makes sense. And our children tell us that, they understand that. So let's embrace that approach and use our skills and knowledge from different subjects to inform it and enrich it. The second principle is this principle of the cycle. And all of you know so well how life works according to cycles, self-sustaining, self-regulating cycles. This beautiful image here of damselflies mating to create the new life that will sustain their species. And if we look at it, as we can do in so many different ways, we can get this real sense of what happens in a cycle from here with food, seed to fruit to seed again. So we have that magic of planting a seed, waiting for it to germinate and for the roots and shoots to establish the plant. And then we work together with nature, watering and weeding the plants and helping them to grow, keeping an eye on them, and ultimately enjoying the harvest of those endeavors, the fruits of the harvest. I think it would be amazing, and there are some great examples around the world, if children in education everywhere had this sense of connection to the soil, to their food, to growing food term by term, year by year, and then most importantly, using that food to prepare meals, salads in the summer, winter soups in the winter, and to really have that lovely connection to the seasonality of what they produce. So giving students time to grow food and make delicious dishes with it is something that not only gives them such a lovely connection to nature, but gives them the skills to help them work and prepare food in the future. Of course, this process wouldn't be complete without the recycling of the food waste. And as you can see here in these amusing photos, when children recycle food waste and it's composted and then goes back out onto the soil, they realize it's quite a smelly process, but one that helps them to understand that the cycle can now begin again. And of course, as I said earlier, the food cycle is one of many cycles we can learn about. And if year on year, we can give our young people in this regard around food and growing food, but in lots of other ways, we will help them to see the importance of working within this idea of cycles. Earlier today, I spoke with a head teacher friend of mine in the Maldives. This is a beach in the Maldives on a local island. And he was saying how their way of educating is still so incredibly formalized that the students are not relating their learning to the reality of what's happening around them. And this is the outcome of, as we know, a wholly unsustainable system. So when our students and those students in the Maldives connect to this understanding, then of course they will challenge why their beaches are full of rubbish. So nature's eternal cycles ensure the never-endingness of life, and it is the perfect model for a sustainable way of living. And when we get our children to see these models at work in different contexts, in different ways, then they really start to appreciate how the world works. Again, I wanted you to see some of these lovely quotes from children and this language that they're developing. And as I mentioned just then, if you year on year keep returning to this word of cycle or interdependence and explore it with them, they will of course start to embed it in their understanding of how the world works and how they can live in harmony with it. I love this quote at the end: we need to find ways to protect the cycle. So the third principle is this principle of diversity and biodiversity. This incredibly beautiful beetle is a fat-legged flower beetle. One of the things that I think is so enriching for this idea of diversity is to get children and young people to become experts in beetles, in butterflies, in different types of bees and different types of flowers. And that when they see a system at work that is rich in diversity, they can see that it is a stronger, more resilient system as a result. So how can we promote expertise in biodiversity? Indeed, expertise in lots of different ways around this theme of diversity. Because the more we do that and the more we connect our children to this understanding of the awe and wonder of nature, the more we and they are likely to care. So where, for example, can we plant native wildflower meadows to encourage the local biodiversity of flowers? Where might we plant fruit orchards in diversity? So every tree is a different type of cherry in this example, or apple or pear. And then to have that lovely experience of tasting different fruits and exploring the language around that. In terms of heritage foods, how might we grow food in diversity? Carrots here in different colors. And again, opportunities to link in to taste and flavors and all sorts of recipes to enjoy. I think one of the really interesting things we're exploring at the moment in education is how we can change the way we teach and learn, and how we can use technology, for example, to provide different experiences of learning. So there's so much potential now in what education can do and offer that will enrich our young people's experience. And again, different examples of projects of learning. So valuing diversity in all things, and this really important message at this time that we celebrate diversity. Our differences are a good thing. And how do we value that and recognize that in one another and in the world in which we live? So diversity for children is about being unique, being special. It's about allowing everyone to be different. And it's about realizing that the world around them has an extraordinary amount of biodiversity, which, as we know right now, is being decimated by many of our practices. We need to heal that, restore that, bring it back. The fourth principle is this principle of adaptation, and this extraordinary adaptation that we see in nature that enables it to survive and ultimately to thrive. So many of you will be very aware of the world of biomimicry and how, for example, the pads on this gecko's hand can hold it on a tree when it's vertical, but how this understanding of nature's designs and adaptations can help us with our own designs in our own lives. So the message behind that being, we have so much still to learn from this incredible natural world, and we need to protect it before it is gone. So nature's adaptations, the bee honeycomb here in the hexagon on the left, and these are the biomes at the Eden Project in Cornwall in England, using the same structures to create these enormous biomes and linking the same shape and the same structure to the bee honeycomb. So we know, I talked earlier about this idea of the future, that a future for all of us needs to be healthy and sustainable. And what might that look like? It's a great question to be asking, and it's a particularly important question for us to be asking right now. So in terms of learning, my sense is that this idea of adaptation is about localizing learning, making it relevant, connecting our students to their place, to their communities, and looking beyond the classroom, beyond the school. And the more we do that, the more our young people are likely to give back, to feed into community, to want to invest their time in developing that sense of community and well-being. So a lovely project here with seasonal soup shared with elders in the community before a harvest festival. And the children referencing back the message from the Second World War of dig for victory and growing on the home front. Many of you will know this is an image of Henry VIII, and his palace, Hampton Court Palace, is just down the road here from where I live. Much of our learning is very backward looking. We look at certain aspects of history, and of course we could question which aspects of history our young people should be learning about. But perhaps we also need to shift the balance away from just looking backwards to looking forwards as well. In the UK now, we have an organization of students called Teach the Future, and they are pursuing an agenda which is very much around interdisciplinary learning and learning that is focused on where they are going and what they will need to do to adapt to the future. These students here, delightful, happy, smiling faces, are from Ladakh in northern India. And in conversation with them, they're very clear that their learning has been too focused on a national curriculum, and yet their world is a mountain world, a world of snow and ice and cold and mountains. And they want their learning to reference that and the traditions and the practices and indeed the harmonious ways of life that have informed that over so many years. So local learning, bringing learning to life in a local context is an important part of this process, this principle of adaptation. The fifth principle of 7 is the principle of health. Nature teaches us what we need to be well. It's inherently a healthy system at work through all its cycles and through all its diversity. One of the really enriching experiences we gave the children, and we are continuing to explore with children, is this expedition on new leadership in sustainability. And this expedition looks at 3 questions. What do I need to be well? What do we need to be well as a team or a community? And what does our world need to be well? And beyond base needs of food and security and water and a place to sleep, children are very clear around the things that matter to them if they are to be well. It's when they're valued, when they stand up for what they believe in, when they connect to nature, and when they have this time for contemplation, for reflection or prayer. In terms of team well-being, It's all well and good to talk about team well-being, but obviously the challenge is to actually do it, to work together on a trek. These students here trekking in the mountains in the Alps in Chamonix. And then again, to ask this question, what does well-being look like in this context in relation to team? These students, these children are 11 years old, but they have a very strong understanding of well-being and communication, of finding the right pace, of seeing need, this lovely quote at the end, seeing need and responding to it. And this third question, imagine learning in a place like that. What does our world need to be well? It's a question that many of us are asking right now. And it's a question that we need to keep asking. And here are some thoughts from 11-year-old children. So they understand the importance of fairness, of a values culture of living in peace. And in terms of the practical elements, making sure our water and energy is clean, that we're recycling everything, there's no pollution, that farming is moving towards regenerative organic practices, and biodiversity is thriving. And this final point, this really important point, that leadership is at the heart of all that work. We have a campaign here in the UK right now around a nature premium, which would go into schools to enable all children to have access to the natural world every week, every term, all year. So really connecting them back to their natural world. So this idea of health and building this story of health, these examples here from a primary school, but to be honest, you could keep this journey going into secondary and beyond. It's something all of us will be exploring all the time. What do we need to be healthy? The sixth principle is this principle of oneness, that we see all these different principles as one, that we understand that we are nature, we are part of this oneness. It was a really important moment at the beginning of our session today to be able to be still and to find our place at the beginning of this time together. This is a beautiful garden in Findhorn in Scotland with these gates and the message, be still and know. And in our busy worlds, we know right now that we also need to be still. These are students in Ladakh that I mentioned a little earlier. And at the beginning of their day, they have this wonderful meditation time. And you can see in this image of this girl on the left here, what peace they find from that. And that when we come from that place of peace, then things will be good in our world. So year on year, project by project, here are some examples of ways in which we can build a sense of that oneness and give children a sense of their context, their place in the world. We are all one in nature. So learning to live as one in peace and love is at the heart of all of this work of harmony and the values that support that and enable that to happen. A final set of quotes from the children. And it's their depth of understanding that I think comes through so powerfully. If these children at 11 years old can see the world through this understanding, they are sure to live good lives that contribute to the well-being of the world. This is the final principle I wanted to share, and this principle weaves through all the learning. It is this principle of geometry, and I was delighted to hear that you've already had a session on the sacred geometry of life, and it's fascinating to see when this geometry is shared week on week with young people, they start to look at things differently. They see that there is a pattern to life. This is a berry in winter, just taken last weekend, with its pentagon shape. This is a cross-section of a carrot, also with a pentagon shape. Many of you will know this image of the five-petaled form of a flower from the orbits of Earth and Venus round the sun. And it's the same in macro as this micro form of a tiny petaled flower in a garden. And we can cross-section an apple and see it again. We start to realize that these patterns are repeated in the world around us, and they're in us too. So one of the important, unique features of this work of harmony is to get young people, indeed anyone embracing it, to explore these remarkable patterns of nature. The starfish, the reflective symmetry of a honeybee, the vesica shape of two overlapping circles that we see in a fish form and in many other forms, the form of a leaf or a petal. We see it in the shape of our eye. And then the many combinations of circles that create the different types of flower forms. And here, finally, a human eye made up of circles. You will know of this spiral of growth, this Fibonacci spiral that we see in this curled up fern and in the shell. And we see it in a cloud formation. And when we curl up our finger and we see it there, we understand our connection to the wider world. This is something that young people find absolutely fascinating. I like this quote from Fritjof Capra: from a systems point of view, the understanding of life begins with the understanding of pattern. And when you develop this work, week on week, term by term, year by year, and children of 11 years old, as in this example, create a Buddhist mandala that looks like that, you realize that they're really building a deep understanding of this sacred geometry. What is also clear is that when we learn geometry, we're developing fine motor skills, good concentration, attention to detail, and this lovely calmness that comes from this work. So as I draw to the end of my presentation, I just wanted to give you a sense of how this learning looks. So year on year, we cover 6 principles of harmony in relation to an inquiry of learning, with the geometry, the 7th principle, running through it all. There are opportunities to develop projects of sustainability as outcomes, as practices in relation to those principles. So here we can look at the principle of the cycle and the cycles of our solar system. We can look at interdependence and community, and how a community that works well is interconnected, where everyone's contributing to the whole. Other examples here in year 5, these students 9 and 10 years old, looking at the journey of a river and the idea of a water cycle, and seeing our water as precious and keeping it clean, interdependence in our ocean ecosystems, and looking at what we need to do to ensure our oceans stay amazing. And then the actual delivery of that is over a 6-week block. So we have a lead question that runs across the top of each week in relation to the big question of the inquiry. You can see the principle related to the inquiry, the great work celebration, and importantly, the partners in learning that can help to enrich that experience for the children. And of course, because it's so essential now that we live sustainably, every inquiry has a sustainability theme running through it. Here's the B inquiry. And as you look to the lower half of the page, you can see that we have a geometry question running through it. The science is the key subject area that needs to be explored through this inquiry. But of course, English, maths, and other subjects should relate to it as well. The oceans inquiry here, and this building of a journey week on week, and then at the end, really getting a sense of, in this example, we have this incredible ecosystem in our oceans, but actually our oceans are not well. So what do we need to do to protect them, to look after them? And that's where their leadership comes into play. And this final example here, is Antarctica worth protecting? Creating exhibitions of work around Antarctica and carving beautiful ice sculptures of penguins to draw attention to this idea of climate change and ice melt. So great works here can be varied, should be diverse, to give this range of experiences for these young people. And on the right there, an example of a penguin ice sculpture. This is one of my favorite quotes. We need to be asking not what sort of planet we are leaving our children, but what sort of children we are leaving our planet. These children here presenting at the Houses of Parliament in London with a vision of what they believe the future should be about, based on their own experiences at a launch event with WWF and Netflix on our planet. So in summary, these principles do teach us a way of living that can create a sustainable future, working systemically, thinking in cycles, valuing diversity, focusing on adaptation to local, living well, seeing that we are nature, and taking time for our inner life before action. So a quote to conclude from the Prince of Wales. I want to show the critical importance of harmony to the health of the human condition and the sustainability of the natural world upon which our human condition depends. So my belief now is we need an education revolution. We need to change things now. We need to evolve again. And we need nature to be our teacher and our guide. This is harmony in Japanese and Chinese. It's two symbols. One of them means stillness and one of them is symphony. What a beautiful combination of things that can guide this new way of learning. Stillness and symphony. So that's my presentation. I'm sure there will be many comments and things that you would like to say. So let me just come out of the stop share. My apologies for that blip at the beginning, but hopefully you have all seen the rest of the slides and we can now open up some conversation around this work of harmony.
Thank you, Richard. Very, very beautiful slides. I love it when there's beautiful images to accompany beautiful words. That just deepens the impact. It makes more elegant the aesthetic. So I just want to compliment you on that. That was beautifully done. I'd like to start with a thread that has been in the chat from Melanie Rajendran, basically around, I would say, kind of the undertow from the past. And I think it's at two levels, just to have your comment.
Sure.
One is that she's making the point that it's not enough to just teach kids about harmony. They also need to be taught about the past in all its kind of violent destructiveness, so that they are as aware of the reality of what happens when you don't understand your connection with nature as when you do. And she pointed out something very, very interesting around the photograph that you showed around those Indian kids from Ladakh. And she asked the question, and there's been documentaries that have been made on this, that, why are they all dressed up in sort of British style uniforms? What about their indigenous uniforms? And if you've read the book by the famous Nigerian author of Things Fall Apart, he makes a very important point that oftentimes we Westerners come into a continent like Africa or South Asia. We want to modernize them. We want to civilize them. We want to bring them into the modern world. We want to educate them. And what we proceed in doing is destroying the very roots that you're talking about. That, these kids in Ladakh or like the kids in Africa were perfectly in harmony with nature until the British showed up.
Absolutely.
And that Christian impulse to make them like us and to civilize them and to Christianize them and to Westernize them was what actually destroyed the cultures that you're seeking to espouse. So I think that's thank you so much, Melanie, for making these points. They're very important. So Richard, what would be your comment on all that?
Well, I absolutely concur. And, you know, if you look at those communities in Ladakh, yes, they absolutely lived in harmony with the natural world around them. And they knew how to live and adapt to those very hostile environments. And it worked. And so I think this is part of what we need to change. And it's very much around listening. I think, you know, teaching has, and probably still is, too didactic. And yet when we ask the right questions and we engage in that conversation and we're open and honest enough about what we're hearing, then we can change things. And, you know, we are where we are right now, and there are a lot of things that are not right. But I think if we are courageous enough to listen to what's being shared, I mean, I was fascinated by those students in Ladakh and what they said. And actually, they've given a very clear message around adaptation to local. Let's learn about this place. Let's not forget our traditions and our ways of life. Because otherwise, as is happening, many of them will leave because they will feel that disconnect. And then those communities will struggle. So I think it's part of the wider debate right now around education. And I look at Indigenous peoples, for example, in all parts of the world, and they teach us so much. And we absolutely need to have the humility to learn from that and not to believe that this way is the right way. You know, the British Empire way was the right way. And, you know, there are many things that we need to be forgiven for what happened there. But we're in 2020 now, and we need to think again. And just one last thing. We did and we still do a really lovely inquiry called "How Can We Learn to Live in Peace?" It was related to the First and Second World Wars. It was very backward looking in that respect. And why do people fight is the other question, if you like, around that. And it was very, very interesting to unpick this sense of what makes people go into conflict with each other. Why do people in the playground even, or the schoolyard, why are they fighting? And how do we negotiate out of that or find ways of living more in peace? What are the key ingredients for that? So yeah, these are great questions to be asking. Thank you, Melanie.
You know, and one thinks of even, you know, Prince Charles, how from very, very early on, it was clear to anybody paying attention, even from afar, that this was an individual of deep sensitivity.
Absolutely.
And deep, I would say, empathy with the natural order and with learning. And, you know, his life has been so buffeted about, you know, that we, even in England and certainly in the United States, this point of view is often termed sort of New Age. And by terming it New Age, it's easily dismissed.
Yes.
So we have some real challenges as we seek to make obvious the obvious. There's nothing more obvious in the world than that we are interconnected with all that is. It's just clear that we are nature. And yet to speak about it is to invite ridicule. And, you know, the accreditation systems in England, in Britain, and in the United States and in Europe generally are protecting a scientific reductionism. And I'd love to have you talk about this a little bit more, because it's very important, I think, for us all to understand as educators that we're swimming against a strong current born of the Enlightenment that reduced matter to random chemical reactions, reduced consciousness to an epiphenomenon of the brain. And as you pointed out at the beginning, because everything was just lifeless matter, chemical processes, the impulse was to compartmentalize everything and create silos. But the very notion of harmony destroys the silos that have been so carefully developed in our engineering departments, in our chemistry departments, in our biology departments, in our law departments. I mean, the whole edifice of education is siloed because it's predicated on the notion that the earth is flat. And you're coming in, Prince Charles is coming in with the reality. It's like you're bringing in, Richard, the Copernican revolution of our day. You're saying, ladies and gentlemen, it's round. And we're part of the roundness. You know, what is it about this that you don't understand? So talk to us just a little bit about your struggles and what it's been like there in one of the bastions of the Enlightenment to bring something like Harmony Project into the educational field. I'm sure it hasn't been easy.
No, it hasn't been easy. And I think there are a number of things that I'd like to share in response to what you've just said. The first is to come back to this point about siloed learning, because, and it comes back to your quote as well, the problems we've created are a lot because we've seen things in silos. We haven't seen the connections between things, the joined upness of things. And I actually think if we're to change one thing in education that will enable us to live more harmoniously and more sustainably, it is that we have to make learning make sense by linking it, connecting it together. And when we do that, then there's almost that sigh of relief that we feel that things are going to be okay. We understand that things are going to work okay. And I see even at the highest level, governmental levels, policy levels, that people are not connecting things enough. And that's where the problems arise. So if I had a magic wand right now and could change one thing in education, it would mean that we were much more project-based. You can still have expertise and specific areas of skills, but you do it with a wider understanding of the broader context of your work. So how do we get that balance right? So we don't lose the specialisms and the expertise, but we do it in a different way that values something more. I think this question of the current system and this incredibly strong emphasis on measure and testing and results and competition is actually extremely unhelpful. And someone I spoke with the other day made a very good point. He said, perhaps we need to just be assessing the whole time. So it just becomes part of a process. So we don't have formalized testing, but we just constantly, and the word we discussed was evaluate, because of course, evaluate has that lovely sense of values in it. So it's much more a together process. So when we shift away from a competitive measure system to an evaluative meaning system, then we start to work together to find the solutions and to improve. And I think in my experience from young people is that when they are given time and space to really deepen their understanding of things, to flow with their learning, they're much more able to make sense of things and to love learning. And one of the concerns in the current system still is that if we focus the learning on this measure element too much, and that's not to say there isn't a need for assessments through what we do, but if that becomes the goal, then learning can become dry and very rigid and fairly narrow, if not very narrow, very quickly. So we need to have this much more cohesive sense of wholeness in learning, and then we will learn to live in that way too.
Well, I could not agree with you more. And I think this point that you're making is fundamental to the entire system, because you know, the edifice of conventional education, East and West, for centuries has been testing.
Yeah.
And the testing is based on memorization. So if you can come into a classroom, take really good notes, memorize information, regurgitate it on tests, you're a star.
Yeah.
And the more left brain you are, the more siloed you are, the more dispassionate you are, the better you do.
Yeah.
Until finally we've produced a world basically of psychopaths who have no regard to either the environment and the impact. I mean, the fact that according to the World Wildlife Fund, as you pointed out, Richard, says that we've lost something like 60% of our biodiversity in 50 years. And I would say 99.9% of the human race doesn't even know that.
Mm.
And the few people who heard it said, oh, isn't that too bad? And then turned the page. That gives you a measure of just how out of touch humanity is. And why now that even when we're in a pandemic, we're so stupefied by our inability to see basic connections that we're allowing ourselves to be shattered and possibly destroyed simply because of our I would say uncaring. And I as an educator, you know what we've done, for example, at Ubiquity, is we've eliminated tests. And we've replaced tests with creative assignments, essay, poetry, music, encouraging our students to interweave their mastery of the content with their subjective experience in grappling with the content, because we want to know how they're growing as a result of their learning. It's not about memorization. The whole root of education, educari in the Latin, is that which brings forth. And that's why I'm so wondrously impressed by the Harmony Project, because you were describing in other words what Ubiquity University is trying to bring into the world. And I would add two other points that have been very important to us, and that is that everything at Ubiquity is collaborative. If we're to be in harmony with nature, we need to be in harmony with each other. So we encourage our students to collaborate on their papers, on their tests, not their tests, their quizzes, their creative assignments, so that learning becomes a collegial, collaborative, holistic enterprise where the inner subjectivity and the outer objectivity are interpenetrating and interweaving all the time. And then finally, we've discovered that if you enter into this world, it can't, and if it isn't really about memorizing for tests, it's got to be more around the competencies, the skills, the qualities that you begin to develop as a human being. Because the essence of harmony, to me, is that it's no longer what you know. You can get everything you want to know out of your cell phone. It's who you are. It's who you are with each other, your community. It's who you are when you're in nature. Do you have the capacity to commune with a tree? Can you communicate with the tree? These qualities, these soft skills, as they're called, are emerging as critical ingredients in the I would say the radical reformation of education as we know it. What would be your comment on that?
I can completely agree with you. I mean, that's why this idea of great works was introduced, because we thought if children half term by half term, literally every 6 weeks, are culminating their learning experience with a great work, a poetry recital, a soundscape, an exhibition, something in the community, something for their parents or carers, then they're going to develop as people who start to believe in what they're saying, really importantly, and young people who see that they have a voice and a part to play. And as you know, coming back to your point at the beginning, if you're in this measure system and you're not very good in that system, you're going to have a pretty low self-esteem. And I was struck by a student who came back to see me. She was a secondary school student. And I said, "How are you?" And she replied with, "Well, I'm an 8C in English and I'm a 7B in maths." And I went, whoa, stop. I want to know how are you? And she actually needed to really think about the question, because she was so tuned into just viewing
Yes.
herself as a grade. And I thought, gosh, that's a pretty damning indictment of what we're doing if you see yourself in your grade. But we can do so much, can't we, as you're obviously doing with Ubiquity University, around this idea of collaboration, of working together. And we know that when we work like that, we can achieve so much more. And all those skills that you highlight, those skills of communication, of really valuing each other, listening to each other. And the other thing that's really important here is this sense that if you share something publicly in a good way, you want it to be your best work.
Yes.
Because there's that sense of, I want to value myself in this. So I think the best work that I have seen has been through great work, not through an assessment.
Yes, yes, yes. And that I would say, there's three pillars, as it were, to Ubiquity's pedagogy. One is collaborative learning around creativity, not testing. The second one is personal development, who you are more than what you know. And thirdly, particularly in a world that is spinning out of control, it's about social impact.
Yeah.
Not only collaborating to learn, but collaborating to solve global challenges. And when you put those three together, you basically have Plato's the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Yeah.
And that harmonized, in our view, is what empowers young people to their highest potential, which at this critical moment in history, all of us need to be living and loving and interacting at our highest potential. So I'm excited, and I applaud you. And I see Sabina. Sabina, talk to us. Maybe you have a final question for Richard.
Well, I had a few questions, and many of them you already addressed, Jim. But I was thinking, this is such an profound model, and really, how to integrate the educational system with harmony and soft skills and everything that we're talking about. And I think there was always also someone who asked this in the chat. It's also, so how is this model then, how do we make a replication of this model and curriculum for others to follow, or to really, give it leverage and become more mainstream in the educational system? Because that's really what we need. We need to echo this out so it becomes the new normal of education, because I think most people understand it and really appreciate it. But as we talked also before we came on, this slight or great resistance to change, that, the educational model has been static in a sense, and sort of redefining that on a larger scale is really the mindset that we now need to implement. I'm just thinking, how has your experience been on that?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because you're right. This needs ideally to be adapted and adopted in so many different contexts. I think the way I would see it is a little bit like a Trojan horse going into the system and then starting to work from within. So what I don't think works is to go in and say you're going to try and change things and make things very different. What I think we need to do is take some of the key elements of a curriculum. So maybe a science unit of learning, or a piece of work around the geography, or even some history, and then build the project around that. So what tends to happen in planning for learning is that, coming back to the siloed approach, is that we take each subject and we plan out what we're going to teach in that subject, but we're not cross-fertilizing, we're not linking different subject areas together. I think if we can take a particular area, if you take a science area, so the solar system, which was one that I think was highlighted in this presentation, and then we say, well, what does the solar system talk to us about? What is it showing us? This idea of cycles at work, and then the patterns that come from that. We can start to open up the learning around the idea of cycles. And then we can look at the maths and the distances and these shapes of and the weights and whatever it is around the planets, and we can start to draw our maths learning through that. We might want to look at our language work in the same way. We might want to do a newspaper article on the first landing on the moon. So we've started with the project in mind, and step by step, we build in the different elements. It's what traditionally, what we used to call in the UK, topic-based learning was about. But the concern with that was it was a bit fluffy, it was a bit wishy-washy. Whereas I think if you do it in this way, and you acknowledge the subject skills and knowledge that need to be taught, but you link them purposefully to a project, then you get the best learning, because suddenly everything really does make sense. So I think that's the key. It's not about wholesale change, because people won't do that. They'll be scared to do that. It's about saying, let's look at it through a different lens. Let's explore it in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's sort of just those two words, making sense. Those are really, really imperative today, making sense, because a lot of it is already common sense. It's just that we haven't really been navigated on that path. And also I'm thinking myself being, you know, an enabler of storytelling, maybe there's also, and I also saw in our chat that, you know, this, how can one propel this on a more larger scale? And maybe that's also by really bringing in this narrative into storytelling, or as some here already who I'm going to connect you with, Richard, who, you know, there should be a documentary on the, you know, the new educational system that maybe is based on the Harmony Project, to really get it out to people, to start to even connect to this wording. And try to sort of shift the mindset. And maybe in the era that we're in now with the pandemic, and we're more remote working, and we have more time for this, hopefully, you know, inner dive into ourselves, maybe that is an opportunity to really megaphone out this kind of new knowledge, in a sense.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I do, and I say it with the greatest of humility, I do see this approach as being about the truths of life. So it's not another education initiative. It's not another thing that we bring into the system and try and tweak and change things around. It's actually just your point earlier, seeing what's there and then connecting to it. And this really important element that I hope came through on the presentation, this idea of the language that we start to speak as we start to interpret and see and understand things differently. And that language becomes our language. And so my observation of that is when you see young people who start to use the language of harmony through their lives, literally in their interactions, then it's really working. So yeah, we have to be very, I mean, the teachers are amazingly hardworking. I always take my hat off to teachers for all that they contribute. So we don't want to make it difficult for them. We need to show them how it's just a different way of looking at things and then opening things up. And the language that will come from it will be remarkable.
And it's interesting because we've tapped a lot, especially, I know, you know, Jim, also in Humanity Rising, language, narrative, storytelling, mindset. It's also interweaved, that language, words, all these energetics that are so interconnected as well, is sort of the key to finding that narrative that really becomes the narrative, not only in maybe circles like this, but in unfortunately, you know, the domination of media and social media, and where we're constantly fed with a specific narrative to, you know, in a sense, just keep us in fear. But how can we, you know, find that new conscious media that will be a parallel universe to the current media, to also get across these kind of ideas? And I think a lot of people are also talking about, you know, how to go from silos into ecosystems.
That's right. And that is the challenge. And particularly if you've got teachers working in separate subject areas, separate departments, to really step back and say, let's try this. And I think there is a need to try things, to trial things, to get the people who want to do it, who are the, you know, the early adopters, if you like, to say, let's give it a go and let's explore it in one context. And I think one of the things that I did throughout this process, and to be clear, this process didn't just happen, it was built over years. One of the key elements was to evaluate it the whole time and to really hear what the concerns were and the things that needed to change to make it work. So, you know, if you take the geometry, the idea was that we would start every week with some geometry in every year group in the school as the starting point for that learning for the week. Well, of course, people will say, yeah, but we've got to do our English and we've got to do our maths and so on. So you then have to rethink it and say, okay, maybe we can just make it a little bit shorter, or we might do it at a slightly different time, but don't lose it. Don't lose the value of it, but just work around it and find a way forward. Yeah.
It just shows how much courage and resilience that is needed in, this time of change, especially teaching, because we know that education is also power, the empowerment of us as humans. And there are so many different sides of, wanting education to keep people in control, or education that actually makes people thrive more. So really been a great pleasure to hear what you're doing, Richard, and definitely that, at least in the ecosystem that we have here, people will be adapting it more and more. And we always need the first adapters, and then come the followers. It's just that we need that patience of that sort of limbo in between. So
thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think it feels like now is the time for this work to happen. And you know that, and many of us here know that. And so, one of the questions was, what could we do to help you? I mean, there's always a funding issue, but actually it's really what you just highlighted. It's about finding opportunities to develop it in different ways. I mean, I think my last point around all of this work is how I'm sensing it is resonating in different parts of the world. So the Harmony Teacher's Guide you just saw at the beginning of this slideshow has now been translated into Japanese, into Chinese. We're looking at translating it into Spanish next. And we're looking importantly to see how we can then support the learning so that people who are interested feel that their hand is being held, if you like, through that early stage of being an early adopter.
Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Sabina. And just to say, if you need any help with the Spanish translation, Humanity Rising has a very strong Spanish translation pod operating out of Colombia. So we may be able to help with both the translation and some early adopter dissemination for the Harmony Project. And I think, just to bring things to a close, I think the point that you made a few minutes ago, Richard, is seminal. The Harmony Project is not just a new approach to learning. It's not a theory. It is the way things are. And that's what makes it a Copernican revolution. And I'd like to just pause on this for a moment. When Copernicus published his work, he wasn't publishing a new idea. He was publishing the reality that the sun is the center of our solar system, ladies and gentlemen. That's just the way it is. It's like the 2 + 2 = 4. It doesn't equal 3. It doesn't equal 5. It's just the way it is. The world is round. It's not flat. That's just the way it is. And I think that that's the beauty of what Prince Charles has been trying to bring in through his book, and what you're trying to do through the Harmony Project. And so I just want to applaud your courage and your intellectual, both acuity and emotional commitment, because there seems to be a rule in history that the more obvious something is, the greater the resistance.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And first they say it's impossible. Then they say it's maybe possible, but it's too visionary. And then finally, when it breaks through, they claim the credit for a great triumph. And we're like Ubiquity. The Harmony Project is in that process of bringing through that sludge of prejudice and ignorance and a tradition that is so embedded in our consciousness that we don't even know it's there, with a new burst of light through the cracks that we're trying to break through in the wall so that the light can shine in. So however we can support this, I'd love to talk with you about having your project produced as a course that we could deliver through Ubiquity University. We're developing a whole new Masters of Business Administration, a whole new MBA, which we're calling a Masters in Regenerative Action. And a course on the fundamentals of harmony with nature would be a beautiful kind of core course for something like this. So I just want to acknowledge your work. Thank you for everything you're doing, and say that we stand with you and would love to be in touch separately about any way that we can help move this forward. So thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. And by the way, there's been a lot of people that have been wanting to know how to get in touch with you and more on the Harmony Project. So if you could put your email
I'll write
in
it
the
now.
chat. And then also we have an after chat session, and it would be wonderful if you could join for even a few minutes. They'll put the link, it's on a separate Zoom line there. They just put it in the link, but if you copy that link, then you can spend some time with folks on the other side for 5 or 10 minutes if you have the time, because I think we want to support this in every possible way that we can. And this after chat session group is just a dynamo of energetic people wanting to help. So thank you for that, and thank you, everyone. And then tomorrow, we're going to extend this conversation with Kathleen Riley. What does harmony mean in philosophy and the arts? And then on Wednesday, we're going to take a tour back 2,000 years to the life of Mary Magdalene and her relationship with Jesus that was forgotten, that was repressed, and is now bursting out through the Nag Hammadi texts with a brilliance and a power that is offering the opportunity of the deepest harmony in Christianity since the 4th century. So this week, everyone, we're going to really, as we approach the holidays, we really want to go deeply into the nature of harmony. What constitutes harmony? We've seen it in education. We're going to see it in art and philosophy. And then we're going to take one of the axial religions through the prism of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus of Nazareth, all through this theme of recreating harmony in a world that's been rent in disharmony for such a long period of time. We actually consider disharmony normal. But it's the harmony that's normal. It's the disharmony that is due from our forgetting of who we really are in the larger scheme of things. So Richard, I salute you. Thank you so much. Hope to see you in the after chat session. Sabinia, thank you. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you again here tomorrow, 5:00 p.m. Central European Time for Humanity Rising. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Splendid, brother.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sorry about that blip at the beginning.